times like this, the phrase cash is king no longer applies. Cash is now God. For preserving cash, you need to budget and reforecast and look at all the current commitments and contracts that you have. You have to streamline all your costs. Cost control and monitoring of spend becomes of paramount importance, and real time information is absolutely critical. Of course, using our own Soldo product helps us control spend at source through being able to restrict card spend to expense categories, setting weekly and monthly budgets on cards, and having access to real time information on spend. So, what we've been doing is obviously maximizing the use of our own Soldo product. But preserving cash there, you still have to get a balance. You can't just kill your business. You have to survive and be ready to act when things get better. You need to look at other sources of funding, government loans, the CIBIL loan scheme, the future fund, talk to your existing investors, look at VAT, PAYE, and tax deferrals. Those are equivalent to short-term interest-free loans. Bounce back loans, which applies to smaller companies, but it takes 2 minutes to apply and you get 25% of your turnover as a loan. But you really need to understand the government criteria as well, because there are some uh, critical things that you need to meet in order to be applicable for the loan. Then, of course, you need to look at your employees and most important, look after your employees. If they're not needed, use the furlough scheme. Talking to suppliers, that's really important. Get the balance right. If you're delaying payments to suppliers, be careful not to just build up debt. We try and negotiate lower payments rather than deferrals. Again, on the customer side, getting money from customers during a crisis is really important. Give them options to pay, maybe discounts. Cash now is better than cash later. Uh, Also, watch if you're factoring or invoice discounting, the cash impact in a negative growth cycle can be is basically amplified negatively. And then, of course, one of the things that happens is you need to switch your focus from acquisition of customers to retention of customers. Another way to preserve cash is look at new sources of revenue. You need to pivot your business, new use cases, keep your current prospects warm even if they're not buying. Look at new markets, especially the markets that are coming back out of lockdown earlier. One of the things that I look at is also the need to fail faster. So basically identifying things that are not working quickly. So in effect, what you're trying to do is extend your cash runway as much as possible. First, to survive through the crisis, and second, to have enough to be able to build momentum when you're coming out of a crisis. Unfortunately, many businesses won't survive, so the likelihood there will be more opportunity at the end of this period for those who can manage through the crisis. And you need to be ready to take that opportunity when you come out of it. Metrics that we keep a closer eye on during a crisis is obviously your cash, your spend, and your cost control, customer behavior, monitoring where they are being affected and helping them where we can, more or less protecting against churn because customers must be facing the same issues that you are. Role during a crisis, has this changed? The answer is yes and no, because the CFO role is still critical to the business, whether you're in a crisis or whether you're not. But definitely, there's more focus on cash management to ensure that the business is adequately funded. Forecasting and planning becomes essential. Forecasting and planning becomes slightly easier when you're forecasting more on cost rather than revenue, but it also becomes harder because it's very difficult to forecast when things will go back to normal. So that's the tricky bit. As I mentioned before, you need tools and reporting to be able to experiment and fail fast. The only way you can fail fast is if you have data that tells you that things are not working. Analysis and insights and real time reporting become absolutely critical during this period. And your ability to pivot your business, generally you never end up with the product that you start with. So especially for startups and in areas where you find that the crisis has affected some parts of your business, you need to be able to pivot your business to look at new use cases. The, the phrase adapt or die becomes very, very relevant. And then communication internally as well as with your investors who are concerned about your business becomes of paramount importance. You need to keep them informed of what's happening because they are very concerned about all the businesses in their portfolio. Expenses that you no longer need. Obviously, I don't think you would need travel and entertainment if everyone is working from home. But I guess it's less about what you need and don't need, and it's more about prioritization. A lot of expenses maybe are needed for investment for long-term growth, but may have to be deprioritized during this period. So capex, for example, maybe that can be deferred and not and given less priority now, but it doesn't mean you don't need it. You need it for long-term growth, but you may not need it right now. One of the first things we've done is we've implemented zero-based budgeting and forecasting. That is starting your budget from scratch, re-looking at all your costs and contracts. It actually forces you to make decisions and look at restructuring. Because I think when you're growing, you become slightly complacent. A friend of mine who's a CEO in a startup in the fashion space commented that this whole crisis has sort of forced her to relook at her cost base and the way she was running a company. And actually, if she had done this a year or 2 years ago, she would be in such a strong position now compared to where she is today. Um, when you're looking at forecasting, it's important that you don't just look at the P&L. Always forecast the balance sheet, always forecast the cash flow. Working capital requirements is absolutely critical, and a lot of people miss that. So, for example, in a crisis, you can't rely on customer payments. So, you have to make sure you're able to forecast not just the fact that your customers are generating revenue, but also the fact that they may not pay you in the time that they usually did pay you in the past. Also, don't forecast in isolation. Key to a good forecast is to get buy-in from owners who are delivering the plan. Then you can influence behaviors and you can put in performance criteria linked to the plan. As mentioned earlier, it's fundamentally easier to forecast in a crisis rather than in a growth metrics, because in a crisis you're forecasting costs mainly and less forecasting growth. But at the same time, the biggest challenge is to try and guess when things will get back to normal. So you may have to take a conservative view as a CFO. It's the single hardest thing to do. Nobody knows what is going to happen and when we are going to totally be out of this crisis. If you look at history, the SARS virus shows us that we'll expect things to continue like this for a few months and improve, and maybe there's a second wave when you go back into lockdown. We don't know. So that's the tricky bit in forecasting is how do you predict when we are going to come out of lockdown and how do you predict when this crisis will be over? And therefore, my view is you should take a more conservative view just to ensure that you have more cash available in the business. And zero-based budgeting is very, very useful, but it's also important that you have a benchmark against historical costs. Because if you don't have that benchmark, you will miss costs. Because if you're saying, let's create a budget now, assuming we start from today, and you create the budget, but there may be some legacy costs that you've forgotten about and haven't included, and then you will get the budget wrong. Therefore, it's important to always have the historical costs as a reference point. And then when you're forecasting revenue, you need to do it on a granular basis. So we track revenue on a granular basis so we can see trends and customer spending and how that's impacted. Example, we can see that travel and expenditure has gone down to single digit percentages of where it was before. And at the same time, other spend on food and digital marketing has increased.